Thank you so much, Tracy. And thank you again, Metro, for asking me to be here with you all. I always love talking about research. So we're going to be focusing in this particular session on focus groups, interviews, and observational research. The session on surveys was really more focused on this idea of getting what's usually quantitative data. And of course, you can get qualitative data from a survey, but if you really want in-depth qualitative data, you need to try interviews, focus groups, and then I'll talk about how you can also do that in observational research. So for today, the focus is on how to conduct these focus groups, interviews, and observational studies in terms of best practices. I'm going to talk about interview protocols and then the protocols you also use for focus groups and observations and why it's important to have those and typically the information that you're going to include in a protocol. And then throughout this process, you'll be able to recognize the situations where you might want to use a focus group, you might need to use interviews, or an observational study might be the best option for you. So we're going to start with interviews. And I know that the title says focus groups first. There was just something about the word flow there. Essentially, we're going to build up from interviews to focus groups, and you'll see why this makes sense when we get to the focus groups. So interviews are actually just conversations, but they're very structured conversations that have a distinct purpose. The thing you have to keep in mind with interviews is that it's not a conversation amongst equal partners because you as the person interviewing or the researcher are actually in control of the topic, in control of the timing, and also the direction of the interview. I'm even going to talk about 3 different types of interviews, and one of them is going to seem a little bit more loose, but even in that process, you'll see that there is a role you play as the interviewer in guiding the process, which means you have a little bit more power in that process. You want to do interviews if you want to understand the meaning of the world of someone else. And this is your opportunity to have them tell you about their perspectives, their opinions, their experiences, because you won't get that just from, your everyday knowledge of someone. And we'll even talk about how you can't quite get that from the observational studies as well. A good interview is going to hinge on your ability to have a really good conversation. So cultivating conversational skills is an important skill set for you to have. If you are the type of person who doesn't like talking to others, you're going to want to practice before you start going into interviews and also focus groups. If you're like me and you love chatting with people, then you're probably going to love interviews, but I'm going to talk about reining yourself in as well so that you don't conversation. This is about you finding out about your participants. So there are steps to conducting interviews and doing a good interview process, but unlike talking about surveys, these are not truly sequential. You often will move between these different things. So we're going to talk about creating those questions, finding people to interview, figuring out which type of interview is the best one, creating that interview guide, piloting, figuring out where to hold your interviews, recording, getting consent, and then also some procedures for conducting good interviews, things to keep in mind. So if you're creating good interview questions, the 3 things I always suggest is that you make sure, one, that they're open-ended, that they're also fairly general, and that they're focused on your topic of interest. Open-ended questions are the ones that encourage people to give you a full answer, a full response. And they usually begin with why, how, or what, because those lead-ins tend to encourage people to say more. You can actually use closed-ended questions in interviews, and those are the questions that lead people to just yes, no. They might even say maybe. But typically, if you're going to have a closed-ended question in your interview, you want to follow it up with an open-ended question. So if you ask someone, have you ever used our self-checkout services? That's a closed question. Answers yes, you might ask a different set of open-ended questions right after that. You might say, well, tell me more about that experience using that service. If they say no, you might ask, well, why haven't you actually used our service? So you can see how those closed-ended questions will benefit the process, but they aren't the only thing you want to ask. Now, general questions just means don't ask anything too complicated. If you're talking for 3 minutes describing something to someone you're interviewing, they're probably going to get lost in the process and forget what you're actually asking them. So if you have something more complicated or something that's a little longer, break the question up. It's okay to have 2 or 3 smaller questions that encourage people to talk and don't require them to get lost in your words or lost in their own heads. And then they're more likely to give you the information you're looking for. And then finally, make sure that you stay focused on your topic of interest. I'm going to talk a little bit about questions that you use that are more designed to build rapport, to build trust, and they're necessary questions as well. But for the most part, you've got a specific reason for conducting an interview, and there's certain things you want to know. So you want questions that are going to help you get the answers to those questions. Now, there are different types of interview questions. The essential questions are the ones that you use that are focused specifically on your research or your topic of interest. And so those are very concrete, direct questions that you're asking about either a service, a program, an activity, anything that falls within those lines, but you're staying focused on that thing. You might have some extra questions, which are just a way to reword your essential questions. Now, if you're using an extra question, it's usually for one of two reasons. One, you've reworded a question because you want to make sure people are paying attention and answering the question that you asked. So you reword a question, you're asking a similar question in a different way, and you're just making sure that their answers line up, just a way to check in on validity of the information. The other option is you ask the question and it's clear the person didn't quite understand. And so you're going to reword it and you're going to ask it again in a different way to give them the opportunity to actually answer that question. Now, throwaway questions are the ones that you actually use to develop rapport. And we probably shouldn't call them throwaway. We mean throwaway as in you're probably not going to analyze them. The information you get from them isn't going to help you in terms of answering the question you have, but they're there to help you set the tone of the interview. They're actually really important because if you can build trust and rapport with the person you're talking to, they're more likely to open up and spend more time talking to you and give you information. Sometimes a throwaway question is something as simple as, how was the drive in? Tell me about the traffic. Were you able to find parking okay? How was your day? Things like that which are more conversational, are really just more about showing empathy for the person. I'm here to listen to you, and I'm interested in you. I do have questions, but I have these questions for you as well. And then finally, you have your probing questions, which are questions you use to get people to give you more information. You might have someone who's just not very talkative. They may start with an open-ended question and they may give you a sentence. And you're like, okay, that's great, but tell me more. And so you would just follow that up and say, oh, so you mentioned that this process was a little bit difficult for you. How so? Tell me more about that. What made it difficult? Or what do you mean by XYZ? Or, hey, can you tell me more about this? And those questions are just a way to let the person know that you would like to hear more. And it's okay to say more in case they're also thinking in their head that I'm talking too much, I'm saying too much. Now, in terms of identifying your interviewees, this is both easy and difficult. You do need to sit down and think about which members of your community you need to speak to. And sometimes it's a simple question of, we know we're trying to target this section of our community, so we need to go find people who fit that demographic. Other times, it's just in general, I just want to talk to anyone who's used our library, used our organization, attended a program. And so you're going to focus specifically on identifying people who fit within those groupings as well. But sometimes it's really about whose story you actually want to hear. And it's as simple as saying, I need to hear the stories of this group of people. I need to hear the story of this group of people. The hardest ones are, I need to hear the stories of the ones who don't use our library. They're the hardest ones to find and the hardest hardest ones to get to come in and talk to you as well. Also keep in mind that if you are interested in interviewing children, this can be done, but you may have to go back and look at the wording of your questions to make sure it aligns with the age of the child. And then I'm going to talk more about parental consent, but always make sure you have consent if you're going to consider doing interviews with children. Now, in terms of figuring out which type of interview you want to do, we're going to talk about unstructured interviews, structured interviews, and semi-structured interviews. And essentially, these are on a continuum. You can go from unstructured all the way up to structured with semi-structured in the middle. I have them positioned this way in terms of likelihood of you wanting to use that particular structure. Now, unstructured interviews means that you don't actually have any predetermined questions. These aren't related. These are actually going to be more related to just participant observations about something. Usually these interviews happen by happenstance. You just stumble into someone who mentions that, they happen to visit the library recently, and you're like, well, I work in the library, and they mention something they experienced there, and you take that opportunity to find out more about what their experience was about. But this also means that you don't have any of these broad categorizations that you would be putting your questions or ideas into. You don't have a hypothesis. There's no expectations of what you're going to find. And usually you're just going to have broad topics that you're going to touch on as a way to encourage them to talk a little bit more. Usually an unstructured interview is a precursor to you determining you need to spend some more structured time talking to people about a particular activity, issue, event, or topic. And so it's one of those things where I happen to talk to someone, hey, they allow me to ask them questions. I think we actually need to look at this for our organization. Now, if you do happen to find yourself in a great unstructured interview, don't whip out your phone and ask for permission to record somebody. It's not good etiquette. Even if you're standing in line at Starbucks, not good etiquette. But you may ask them, hey, can I follow up with you? Would you be interested in talking with me more? And put them into the queue for potential interview participants as well. Now, structured interviews are on the complete opposite end of the interview spectrum. You've got every question predetermined. It's really more like those types of survey questionnaires where you have people circle, check, and just move forward. There are no open-ended questions. Everything's pretty much reduced to just a closed-ended question, yes or no, do you like this? Those types of things. Your categories are already predetermined. Your questions are all specific to the categories, and you probably already have a hypothesis about what you're going to find. You already know that you're going to find majority of people are going to like one service and not like another service. You're just trying to confirm that. And so these are good for really short, quick surveys, short, quick interviews that you may be conducting as, standing at the door of the organization, asking people who are coming in and out if they wouldn't mind answering a few questions. And again, you could almost equate this to just the survey questionnaire, but in this case, someone's actually asking those questions to someone. Now, the semi-structured interview is what I call the sweet spot. It's right in the middle. You're going to have an interview guide, which I'm going to talk about a little bit further, and it's going to help you keep things in order, and it's going to help inform the nature of your question and determine how things are going to flow, but only in the sense that you're not going to miss something. If you didn't have the interview protocol and you were doing a completely unstructured interview session, you might miss something, but you're going to have a guide, and it's going to help you keep in mind what you're looking for, but you may wind up bouncing around with your questions because someone may answer your question without even being prompted because of a previous question you asked that's just connected, at least for them, to the later question. Your question should be open-ended in this case. You can actually have a follow-up question that's closed-ended that you use as a way to confirm that you've heard what they've said, or vice versa. You can start again with that closed question just to figure out which direction you need to go. Yes or no. Yes means I go left. Right. No means I go right in terms of asking questions specific to their experiences. Now, I like semi-structured interviews because they feel more relaxed. Use this, of course, for longer interviews, not as short as the structured ones. And you're typically able to try to record things because someone knows they're being interviewed. They didn't just bump into you out somewhere else and start talking about the library. Now, when you also think about the types of interviews, you think about interaction types. Face-to-face is always going to be preferred if you're trying to talk to people and really get an understanding of who they are, build rapport, get their experiences. But we all recognize that sometimes we have to do this online. So video calls works just the same as a face-to-face interview. You still get some of that interaction. You still get some of that being able to see facial expressions, body language, things like that. Phone calls, of course, you've probably all done phone surveys. Well, you can do a phone interview as well. Usually not recommended if it's going to be a really long interview. A lot of people don't like being on the phone for extended periods of time, but shorter interviews, of course, can be conducted by phone. You can actually conduct interviews by chat. Works really well if you have someone who just likes to chat. They're not like comfortable with being on the phone. They don't have time to come see you in person. And if you type fast and they type fast, then chat works perfectly fine. Email can also work. It can be a lot of back and forth with email. Following up takes longer because you're having to send follow-up questions if someone didn't fully address what you were asking in the original relay of questions you had. And it can be a little bit cumbersome, but if that's the only access you have to someone, no issues at all using email to conduct an interview. Now, I keep mentioning that protocol. It is a guide for you. This is a pre-designed form that you're going to use to record information that you collect from your interviews. This allows you to take notes during your process, but also allows you to keep your thoughts organized. If you get engaged in an interview and you're having a conversation, you will see just how quickly you will forget that you're supposed to ask a certain question. It happens very easily. It's not something that you're doing because you're a bad interviewer. It's just because you're human and you're having a conversation with someone. So your protocol is going to help you stay on track and make sure you don't forget something. Now, if you're going to be using your protocol, I always suggest that you have some type of header information where you're recording, when the interview is taking place, who you're conducting the interview with, what the purpose of the project is. Also, leave space for yourself to actually record information. I tend to be a note taker by hand, but you could also, of course, use an iPad, use a laptop, whatever makes the most sense for you. And though I do suggest trying to memorize your questions as best you can, again, it's almost impossible to remember every question, but this is just more about making sure you're not head down and reading from a script and not paying attention to the person that you're having a conversation with. So just making sure you're at least really familiar with your questions and the general flow of your interview process will make it a little bit easier. And then remind yourself to close out your interview session. So always have like a little blurb at the bottom that reminds you to close out things and thank your participants. You'd be surprised at how quickly we forget to say that because, once again, engaged in conversation, and there might be some things you really do need to say to them in terms of, this is what we're going to do with the data. If you would like more information about how we're using your data or the results, you can contact me. Those are the types of things you want to have at the end as well. And so this is an example of a protocol, at least in terms of questions to ask and then reminders about probes. So don't forget to probe them about things like their dietary habits if you're asking them questions about the kinds of foods they consume daily. Now, of course, I'm not expecting anyone in the library to ask questions about food choice, but this was just a good example of how someone was reminding themselves of how to probe if someone didn't quite give you the information you were looking for. Now, the one thing about this protocol that I feel is missing is that there's no clear space between the questions for notes to be taken. So this was probably just one that someone had that was just, these are my questions. And they hopefully had a different ability to be able to record information that they were hearing on a different document, or they may have actually had another person doing that part of the process while they focused on just asking the questions. The other thing to remind you is please pilot your questions. Just like with surveys, you need to make sure that the questions you're asking are actually the right questions and are being asked in a way that someone's going to be able to respond to them. And you can start with your colleagues, get them to read them first, let them say whether or not they feel the question makes sense and works for your audience. And then try to find someone who's similar to the participants that you're interested in, because you want them to test it to make sure they understand the question, to make sure the language is at the right level, and then to make sure that if you need to define something, that you already know that we should go ahead and define this, because I can already see that they're struggling with what do I mean by that concept or that topic. And then also see if there are questions missing. So just like with surveys, someone can tell you, I was expecting you to ask me this question after you told me what the topic of your interview was. So you can now consider adding in those questions if you think they're necessary. Now, in terms of identifying a location, usually your thought process is that I want them to come into the library. And sometimes that's not going to work, or people aren't going to be as comfortable engaging in an interview in that space. So you can actually try to consider a neutral location if one exists that works for both you and the person that you're trying to interview. Sometimes you can actually ask the participant to select the location where they're most comfortable. Keep in mind that your safety is also important. So if you don't feel comfortable going to whatever location they've selected, continue to work with them to compromise. Definitely avoid noisy locations. I tried conducting an interview in a coffee shop because my participants selected it and it worked for their time. And at the end of that, I realized that my recording was useless because I heard nothing but coffee being made and people talking and even dogs barking. It was a very strange situation. Your main goal is to try to balance both privacy and safety when you're selecting locations for in-person interviews. Now, if you're doing them online, you still want to try to have a quiet space for yourself, and you want to encourage your participant to try to find a quiet space where they're not going to be distracted. And then strong internet access is going to be probably one of the better things that you could have access to. So using the Starbucks Wi-Fi for either of you may not be the best option, or using Wi-Fi in a public place where it may be dropped may not be the best option. Sometimes you do just have to work with what you have, which is perfectly fine, but just be prepared to acknowledge that if we get dropped, this is how you get back into our conversation, so that the person knows what to do and so that you know what to do as well. You also want to make sure you're using adequate recording procedures. Try to get the most high quality equipment that you can, because this is going to minimize issues with quality. The good news is that these little voice recorders are much more accessible in terms of cost now. They used to cost over $100. You can get them for $20 now, and they work really well. I always suggest you also have two recording devices going, a main device and a backup device. I've had plenty of times where my main device stopped for some reason, and my backup device saved me from having to ask someone to conduct the interview again. And if you're doing the virtual interview, and actually even if you're doing in-person interviews and using either your phone as a backup device or a digital recorder, don't forget to hit record. It's the simplest overstep that people have, oversight that people have, is they just forget to hit the record button. Most virtual software is going to have a record option, and usually you're going to be able to actually just use that built-in option to record for you, which is going to give you video and audio, even if all you need is the audio. Even if you're doing that online, use a backup recorder as well. Find a way to record both, at least their response. Even if you can't get your responses, record their response as well. Make sure you're getting consent. And so you want to verify that your participants actually consent to being interviewed. I actually tell people to go ahead and create an informed consent document, even if you're not doing a formal research study that's being, cleared by an IRB at an institution. You actually want to give them information and confirm and make it formal that they are agreeing to be interviewed for this process. And then even once I have this informed consent document, I will ask them to verbally consent as well before I start an interview, because I just want to make sure that they're comfortable and that they know that they're part of this process. And if you're working with children, get that parental consent first, but also get the child's assent to participate. Children are allowed to step out of any conversation that they want to. So even if their parents tell them, I've signed you up for this interview, they have the right to say no. And that's something you should definitely honor and respect as well. Now, you also want to make sure you're just using good interview procedures. So don't forget to introduce yourself, which I absolutely did for this presentation. I'm Dr. Bright. But don't forget to introduce yourself. Follow your interview protocol. It is there to help you. It is there to keep you on track. It's there to make sure you don't forget anything. Encourage your participants to do most of the speaking. When you listen back to any recording where you've done an interview, if you hear yourself more than you hear your participant, then you've got some practicing to do to make sure that that changes to where it's more 70-30, 80-20 towards the participant speaking, less you. Also, make sure you're keeping your participant on topic. Sometimes they're going to go off on a tangent. You just need to reel them back in, do it in a polite way, but just bring them back in and keep them focused on what you're really trying to find out. And then never hesitate to ask them if they have questions for you, because sometimes their questions will actually spark further conversation that's related directly to what you're trying to figure out. And it's just something maybe you didn't think about. And then when you close your interview, offer a recap. Offer this idea of, this is what we talked about. This is what I heard you say. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with me? That type of thing. And then be sure to share your next steps, what you're going to be doing with the data. If you're interviewing more people, let them know you're doing that. And then thank them. Always, always thank them at the end of the process. Now, this is where we say segue, because we just spent time talking about, I'm talking to an individual, I'm finding out more about them. But sometimes you need to actually talk to more than one person at a time. Sometimes it is about time saving, but sometimes it's also about the nature of the topic and what you're trying to get information on. And this is when you're going to use focus groups. So focus groups are just interviews with groups rather than individuals. And that's a little too basic, but that's the general idea. There's a little bit more that goes into it than just saying I'm interviewing a group because of the different dynamics of the people, but you are still having a structured conversation that just happens to be taking place, not just with you, and a participant, but the participants in a good focus group are also having a conversation with each other as well. And that's the beauty of a focus group, because sometimes one participant will say something that will spark a response from another participant and just lead the conversation in a way that you never expected, but it's all valuable for the questions that you're asking. And so this is a really good option if you're trying to get a new perspective on something, or if you're trying to solve a problem that is affecting usually your participants and you need their perspective on how do we fix this? What would actually work for you? So the keys to a good focus group: having a focus group protocol. Looks almost exactly like an interview protocol, has your questions, has reminders, has the opening and closing, has ways to remind yourself to probe if something isn't quite clear. Looks almost exactly the same. Only difference is there might be some reminders about how to manage a focus group. And I'm going to talk about that too. You also want to ensure you have manageable group sizes. So 4 to 12 participants per group is optimum. 6 to 8 is what I call the sweet spot. I have trouble controlling a focus group if there's more than 8 people in the space, especially if I'm trying to encourage everyone to speak up or make sure everyone has time to actually share information. The larger your group, the fewer questions you probably want to ask, because if you've got 8 to 10 or 10 to 12 people and you're trying to ask 6, 7 questions, that's going to be difficult for everyone to engage with. If you only have 4 or 5 people, you can probably get through that many questions, but the more people you have, the fewer questions you're probably going to want to ask so that you can ensure everyone has an opportunity to speak up. You also want to maintain control of that group. So you need a well-trained focus group facilitator who can actually help with that process. In this case, it's okay if you don't actually facilitate your own focus group. There's nothing wrong with finding someone who has this skill set and asking them to support the process, but you can definitely get trained on this process. You can become a focus group facilitator, but if you're not quite there yet, feel free to go out and find someone to help you with the process. And having a second person there for support is actually ideal. I say in person, but again, you can do this online. I've conducted many focus groups online where it would have been nice if I'd had a backup person for me to help support the process, and sometimes even just checking in on the technology side for people so that I wasn't having to stop to do that. So audio recordings are ideal for focus groups. Video recordings are actually good, but there can be ethical issues with doing video recordings of groups. And having a scribe, not ideal, but definitely workable. If you have a group of people and you're asking them to be part of a focus group, you need to make sure they all agree that being audio or video recorded is fine. If even one person says no, then you do not audio, do not video record, and you're going to be writing things down. This is where a second person is definitely helpful to help you keep track of what's going on and make sure you're recording the information in an accurate way. The other thing about focus groups is that you do need to set ground rules. So as we shared here, Tracy shared the ground rules for this particular type of session. It's very similar for focus groups. You want those ground rules there to set the tone of the session and also the behavior and expectations of that group. Keep in mind that safety and comfort are key. That's what you're shooting for. And so a few example ground rule topics that I usually cover and address and that are pretty standard as well. Reminding people that this is voluntary, that they can step away at any time. Reminding them that it's okay to not respond to certain questions. Maybe the question doesn't feel relevant. Maybe they don't feel comfortable responding to that question, but that's perfectly fine. There are no right or wrong answers, that this is about their opinions and their perspectives and their experiences. And so that's all good. And that everyone should respect everyone else's responses. It's okay to disagree with the concept, but not to disagree with the person. And that just reminds people to not go after someone personally. And you can focus on what they've said and kind of build on that, but you're not there to attack someone. Staying on topic, so reminding people to stay on topic. And then, of course, as a facilitator, that person is going to keep people on topic as well. Avoiding overly personal or detailed information. This is not about sharing, especially medical information, health information. That's something that should not be shared in this kind of open group, which is why you usually will also have either what we call the Vegas rule or the Fight Club rule. So, what happens in Vegas, what happens in focus group stays in focus group. Or the first rule of a focus group is that we don't talk about the focus group. It's a reminder to be confidential as much as you can. And you're trusting other people to be confidential as well, which is why you also do not share overly personal information in case you aren't quite sure that everyone in the focus group is going to be above board. and not share that information outside. Another one I don't have here, but one that I use a lot is the reminder to use I statements as well. Focus on your experiences as a member of a focus group. Don't share someone else's story, which usually encourages people to not share outside of the focus group because that's not your story to tell. Now, as a facilitator, you have a very distinct role. You have to make everyone comfortable. You need to guide the process. You're watching out for all the nonverbal cues as well. You're looking for people who look nervous, scared, bored, happy, angry. You're looking for people who might be, drumming their fingers on the table, moving their legs, getting up, moving around. Not everything is a bad thing, but it's just something for you to pay attention to. You're trying to keep that conversation on topic, and you're there to confirm understanding. So you can repeat things just to make sure that you are actually hearing what was said, but avoid making assumptions about the meaning of what someone has said. And then treating everyone equally, not paying too much attention to one person, not paying enough attention to one person, and not including your own personal opinions in this process. And I'm going to let you know right now, that is the hardest part about being a facilitator. It is so easy to want to respond to something someone has shared, to be like, I can't believe that. How dare that happen to you? That's a personal opinion. It can build rapport, but it's starting to show a little bit too much of the facilitator in the role and less of the person who's just there to guide this conversation. Because remember, this is a conversation and it's not about your experiences, it's about their experiences. A few other considerations for focus groups: being careful of your tone of voice. If you tend to have a monotone, working on cleaning that up. If you tend to come across aggressive or abrasive when you speak, something you might want to work on. It's definitely not intentional for most of us. It's hard to sometimes change your tone of voice, but keep in mind just being very much aware of your tone of voice, watching your facial expressions, but also watching their facial expressions, looking at how much time you're on the recording. So just like the interviews, if it's more you and less of your participants, then as a facilitator, you're spending too much time talking as part of the process. Being aware of the location. Some focus groups, you actually want to have them in a space where everyone can kind of see that, hey, those people are having a focus groups. Other cases, you don't want that. People don't necessarily want people to know that they're engaged in this process. So you need to make sure you're balancing out how comfortable people are being watched or not watched, but also their safety in being in a closed space. And making sure you're balancing this idea of how much you're showing agreement with people or asking people for agreement versus prompting them to tell you more information. Give me more information about this, rather than asking them, do you agree with that? Because again, that's kind of that closed answer versus the open question answers. And then if you have overly dominant participants, finding an easy way to guide them back into the process and encourage them to speak a little bit less. If you have someone who's overly reserved, making sure they have opportunities to speak up. And then being careful about slang and jargon unless it's absolutely necessary for the process. Now, a few unexpected interview and focus group things to be aware of. Sometimes people will not behave the way you expect them to. This includes screaming, crying, and leaving the space. Happens all the time. Making sure your questions are non-leading and non-persuasive. Being aware of the power dynamics. Remember, you're in charge as a facilitator, as an interviewer. People are often aware of that. And if you come across as being overly dominant, they may not necessarily engage with you in the conversation. And then if you're going to be transcribing things, just be aware of all your options. If you're talking about virtual focus groups and virtual interviews that have been recorded through Zoom or WebEx or Teams, they will actually produce a transcript for you. And then all you got to do is clean them up. Much easier, much less expensive. But there are companies out there that do transcribe, and some of them actually charge decent prices. If you're going to do it by hand, please know you're talking about hours worth of work. Now, if you can afford to pay someone to do it by hand, and it's going to give you more quality to your data, but also just time consumption, the time consumptive part of it, sorry about that, in terms of how long it just takes to transcribe by hand. So keep those options in mind depending on how many interviews, how many focus groups, how long they were, and if you need the information much more quickly, you may make some decisions about the transcription as well. All right, so last but not least, we are going to talk about observation basics. And this isn't going to take us too long because the main thing about observation studies is that we cannot possibly cover every type of observation out there. So I'm going to focus just on two, and the two that are usually most relevant to library settings in terms of I want to do this type of observation. So direct observation is just you trying to gather very accurate information about events or activities. This is something you usually do if you've already asked someone how long did it take you to do something, and they give you a roundabout answer. They don't remember. They're like, oh, 20 minutes, 15 minutes. And you actually want to know, how long does it actually take to do this particular activity in the library? Then you would actually watch them do it instead of relying solely on them telling you how long something took. And so what this is going to do is give you more precise data about the timing of something, the duration of something, the frequency, especially of behaviors. And then keep in mind that if you're doing direct observation, these behaviors have to be overt. You have to be able to see it. You have to be able to watch it. If you can't watch it, you can't see it, then you can't observe it. And then usually this is very formal. So this means you've planned this and very systematically thought through the process. You've created a protocol to help guide the process. And you're probably also thinking about, oh, where am I going to sit? How long am I going to be there? What days am I going to be there? Who else is going to be around? All those things are predetermined when you do a direct observation. Now, participant observation, and this is a lot like the interviews on this whole continuum. So if you're talking direct observations, that's a lot like that structured interview where things are very structured and focused. Participant observation is kind of that middle point where you're doing this in a natural setting and you're also taking part in whatever activity is being observed. So you are part of the observation. The goal here is to try to learn a little bit more about things that are explicit and tacit in terms of how people do things socially. You're grounding this in their reality and your own reality, and you're part of now the daily life of this group that you're taking part of. Whatever activity they're engaged in, you're doing the same things. As part of this process, you can sometimes interview people because you're engaging with them. They know you're there to observe them. This is not one of those secret observations. So it's not a case of, let me get to know this person so I can find out more information. They know your role as a participant and as an observer, and you're building a relationship. So they're willing to talk to you as they're going through whatever process you're also engaging in, whatever activity you're taking part in. Now, in terms of observation, if you're doing this outside of the library, just make sure you have permission and that you have access to the setting. But if it's inside the library, it's your space, you're usually not too worried about that. You do want to decide on the sample data that you're going to collect. So this could be deciding on the time of day, which day, if you're doing something on the weekend versus the weekday, and then which behaviors are you actually trying to observe? What are you actually looking for? And this is what you're going to use to create your observation protocol, because on that protocol is going to be a reminder of what the behavior is, what you're looking for, and also a way for you to record information about when it happened and how often it happened. And so you're going to gather your data, and then you're going to create some field notes while you're gathering data. And what field notes are a way for you to keep track of everything that's going on. Some people will have their field notes on their observation protocol. Others will have their field notes separate. It'll be like a journal you have, a book, a notebook that you're writing in, and you're just keeping track of things, just things that kind of pop into your head as you're seeing what's happened, as you're part of the observation. And then you do a little pre-analysis of that data. It just means looking at what you're seeing to make sure, one, that your protocol has worked, that you've been able to identify the actual activity, but then also to make sure that there isn't something else you need to start looking for as you move forward with the process. Maybe you need to do more observations, or maybe you find that you're seeing the same thing, so you don't need to observe anything else. And then leaving the field, which I put in asterisks here, if you have decided to do an observation in a place where you have now infiltrated a group and you're working with that group, don't just disappear on them. Make sure they know that you appreciate them allowing you to be a part of that process, and that you're now going to go off and do the research stuff you're going to do, but you're not just going to abruptly disappear and leave them wondering what happened and also what happened to the data that you collected. I did want to show you this. This is just an example of field notes, and someone named Carolyn Wong posted these online, but I thought this was just a very interesting example of how someone can do a variety of writing and drawing and doodling and taking notes in their field notes. And so in this case, this person was reviewing activities taking place in a library, And you can see they start talking about the different floors and even things like the restrooms, what's on the floor, what's the seating look like, are there shelves here, are there desks, just all the different things that you would need to know about the space. And you can even guess from this that they're looking at the space. How is the space being used, or how is the space not being used, and what's actually happening in that space? So there's a lot of interesting things here, and you'll be able to have access to the slides for anyone who wants to look at this and kind of blow it up. But you can see just the variety of different activities that this person was able to observe by looking at the different floors in this library. Even odd question about the restrooms, saying on 2 and 4 there's females, but I assume 1 and 3 are male, which leads you to wonder if they ever made it down to floor 1 and 3 to verify that, or if something else was going on when they were looking at that information. Now, a few additional considerations when we talk about observations. To keep in mind, there are some things you should not observe, and also some places you may not want to be making observations. Especially be careful about doing observations of children's spaces. There are, of course, parents who might be more concerned about an individual who is not attached to the children staring at the children. But just be aware that some things you just shouldn't try to observe. Also keep in mind that even if you are participant observer, you are probably disrupting the setting that you're in. And so you want to work on not necessarily being overly disruptive when you're being an observer. You have a role to play. Your role is to collect data and find information, but you don't want to disrupt the activity or the event that's taking place. And then also, what is not being observed? And the beauty of observation is that you see people's real actions, but you don't necessarily know why. I don't know why this person is doing that. I don't know why they chose that particular option. And so what's missing is the ability to talk to them or have them verbalize their actions. And with that in mind, the last thing I'm going to mention, and we're not going in depth here, but I wanted to introduce 2 concepts related to usability testing, which we do a lot of in libraries. But the cognitive walkthrough and the heuristic observation are a way for you to both watch and hear and learn and ask questions throughout the process. So with the cognitive walkthrough, typically you've identified a task and you've written up these instructions, and you want someone to go through these instructions and comment on the performance of the task with the goal of them being successful. So you want to see if the instructions will lead them to successful completion of a task, and then you're going to analyze the actual process and comments because they're thinking aloud. They're telling you what they're experiencing, what they're seeing, what they're doing. And if they're successful and if they're not successful, you're going to be able to fix things. And then heuristic observation, very similar, but in this case, you typically just have a set of standards or principles that people should be following. Cataloging is a good example there. And you identify experts to evaluate whether or not those principles or standards are actually being applied the way they're supposed to, or if there are problems related to the issues or the standards. And then you spend time debriefing the experts about their experience, trying to apply the principles or trying to apply the standards, and you come up with solutions for how you're going to change the principles or standards. So these are just 2 examples of how you might be able to go beyond a basic observation and integrate a little bit of interview process into observational processes so that you're getting not only what they do, but what they're thinking when they're doing it as well. There we go. And I think I promised time to ask questions, and I think I lived up to that today. So thanks, everyone.